Carrie, and thank you all for being here. I know many of us at this point in the pandemic are experiencing Zoom fatigue or online meeting fatigue, and I know that it's sometimes a struggle to participate in these, but thank you very much for being here. We are recording the talk today as well as broadcasting it on Facebook, so there will be multiple opportunities to view it now and in the future. I saw some questions about captioning in the chat. I'm not sure if we have that capability through Zoom. Carrie or Schroeck could probably let me know on that. But I do think we'll be able to, later when it's uploaded, I think we'll be able to include captioning. So thanks for pointing that out. And that's something that with my classes, as Carrie mentioned, I teach at Detroit Mercy Law, and I teach environmental law and direct an environmental law clinic. And one of the things I learned over this past year was how important it is to actually have the captions and to make that available, to record everything and to have that available for students for them to go back and re-listen to things and to make sure that they caught all of the material. So thanks for raising that question. Before I get into the presentation, I'd like to just briefly do a land acknowledgement. And this is something that we've started doing as part of our Cures events, including our windshield tours and our different trainings. So I'm just going to read this, so please bear with me for a moment as I read it. But I'd like you to think about our sense of place and where we are and those that have come before us. And this land acknowledgement was created with the intention of being used by a university here in Metro Detroit. And it was written by a man named David Pitwanaquat. And David, I learned recently, he's an alum of Detroit Mercy Law. He was in our dual degree program, which is a joint program between Detroit Mercy Law and the University of Windsor Law School, where students after 3 years of study could then be licensed attorneys potentially either in the United States or in Canada. And so David, while he was in law school, had an internship with the city of Detroit, and he wrote this land acknowledgement. This university sits on the traditional lands and territory of the Anishinaabe people, also known as the Three Fires of the Confederacy, comprised of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. Since the beginning of time, it has served as an important and sacred place for these tribes and many other tribes throughout this region. Today and every day, we acknowledge the peoples native to this land and the land itself. It is this university's responsibility as an academic institution to respectfully discuss and educate about the traditional people of this land and the hardships they have faced and continue to face. Our intent is always to educate and enlighten, never to accuse or blame. So thank you for that. And that's typically when we would start our windshield tours, we talk a little bit about the history of what is now Detroit and going back to indigenous peoples through colonial settlement, through the Great Migration, and through today. And so thank you for bearing with me as we did that land acknowledgement. And I think it's a good way to kind of center us and to think about our sense of place as we begin this quick tour. And so I'll show a few pictures. I'm going to share my screen here in just a moment. I'll talk about some of the major industrial sites, some of the major sources of pollution that we have here in Detroit and Southeast Michigan. And then I think that will help inform our discussion as we go forward throughout the advocacy training. And I should also say that if you have questions as I'm going through the presentation, please go ahead and put those in the chat. Carrie will help me monitor those and will flag me if I've spoken too quickly or used a word that we don't understand. And please, anything like that comes up, if there's a term that I use that you're not sure of and you'd like me to define it, please feel free to ask that in the chat and we'll do that. Again, I'm used to teaching law students, so if you have questions, anything is fair game, and I'll do my best to answer those as we go throughout the program today. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and fire up the virtual bus here, get the screen sharing going. Okay, so as both Carrie and Rochelle mentioned, this is a presentation that's put on by our Cures Center at Wayne State University, and the Cures Center is funded by the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. This is a little bit dated picture now of our Cures community engagement team. We'll have a few new faces to add, including Rochelle, who joined us right around the time that things were shutting down due to COVID-19. And so we haven't been together in the same room to take pictures yet. But this is a picture of our team. And just to talk a little bit about the community engagement work that we do, we have a community advisory board. And this is really important to our work at the center. This list here on the slide is some of the organizations that are part of our community advisory board. We've had others that have participated in the past, and we know that we'll have more groups and different folks involved in the future. But this is a really important way for us at the Cures Center to link the scientists and the researchers with the community and to really inform all of the research that we do at the Cures Center. And our intention is, whenever possible, to conduct research, to conduct analysis that is a result of requests from our community and from the Community Advisory Board. So we try and have the research flow in that direction. And then it's our responsibility, Carrie and Rochelle and I and others on the community engagement team, to then bring that information back to the community, to share it, to put it in such a fashion that where it makes sense and that where it can be valuable to our community partners. And so that's just a really important part of what we do is connecting with different organizations, different groups, different neighborhoods with the research that's going on at the Cures Center at Wayne State. Okay, so let's use our imaginations a little bit, but if we were on our windshield tour, one of the first stops that we would take is we would head down from Midtown, we would head downtown, and we would go to Southwest Detroit, right by the Ambassador Bridge. And for purposes of environmental health and environmental justice, it's important to talk about the Ambassador Bridge because this is the busiest trade port, the biggest port of entry, biggest border crossing in terms of trade and traffic between the United States and Canada. And there's a lot of trucks. Those of you that either live in Southwest Detroit or have spent any time down there, you know that there are lines of trucks often that are queued up, that are in line, waiting to go through customs and to cross over into Canada. Of course, it's the same thing on the other side. And that situation was exacerbated for many years while the new highway was being built and while you had many trucks lined up on Fort Street. And then, of course, now we have the new Gordie Howe International Bridge, which is in the process of being built and constructed. But being there under the Ambassador Bridge, listening to the rumbling of the trucks and the cars going by, often you can smell the diesel fumes. You might feel a heaviness to the air from particulate matter, the actual pollution in the air. And then you'll look around and you'll notice that there's neighborhoods. You'll notice that there's people living there, that there's businesses, that there's parks, park right near the bridge there. And so it's a good place for us to begin our tour and to think about the impacts of pollution, whether it's from those trucks, those motor vehicles, or from some of the industrial sites that are also very close to the bridge. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about the Ambassador Bridge in a minute when we discuss something called petroleum coke, this oil refining byproduct that was being stored along the banks of the Detroit River. We'll talk about that more in a little bit, but just note that where these petroleum coke piles that we'll talk about, they were just a little bit downriver from the Ambassador Bridge here along the shoreline of the Detroit River. Okay, the next picture that we have there on the right, that's actually one of the coke ovens, the furnace there on Zug Island. Zug Island is it actually is an island at the confluence or the connection of the Detroit and Rouge Rivers. Zug Island is, it's been an industrial outpost, I guess, for quite some time. And there's really fascinating equipment. And when you look at it, when you're close to it, it almost looks otherworldly, the type of machinery and equipment that they have there at that facility. And there's also a very distinct odor, a smell of sulfur that you'll notice being near Zug Island. And there's also just a drone, a steady kind of almost like a grinding, droning noise that you have in the background from all of that heavy industrial activity going on there at Zug Island. Also, if we were driving by Zug Island and looking at it, we would be very close to the wastewater treatment plant. And this is for the Great Lakes Water Authority, formerly Detroit Water and Sewage Department's facility, the wastewater treatment plant that processes the municipal and industrial sewage waste from many communities in Southeast Michigan. So it's not just Detroit, it's over 100 communities that send their sewage there to be treated before that treated wastewater is eventually discharged or sent into the Rouge River or the Detroit River. And the Rouge River, of course, joins the Detroit River, and so it all ends up there and then works its way downstream towards Lake Erie. You'll also notice next to the wastewater treatment plant, when we're driving by, if we, on a nice day, we have the bus windows open, and you could smell the odors coming off the treatment lagoons at the wastewater treatment plant. One way that a very important way that we treat wastewater is by things called settling ponds. And these actually look like kind of like large ponds or almost swimming pools, but you wouldn't want to go swimming in. But they're these large pools where the waste, it allows solids to sink to the bottom, and then they can be separated out, and then the rest of the water go through its treatment process. So these are called settling ponds. And in those settling ponds, they also add bacteria that eats things like phosphorus and nitrogen that are present in human waste and other types of waste. And those little bugs, little bacteria eat the waste, and that's an important part of treating our sewage before it's discharged into the river. That also creates an odor. And so you would notice that as we're, again, going along the river here, along Jefferson, next to the wastewater treatment plant. So there's another shot on the right there, a different angle of Zug Island, a little bit closer, and you can kind of see a little bit more what some of that equipment looks like there as part of the Coke battery. And on the other side, on the left-hand side, we have, this is from one of our tours last year in the fall of 2019. And Brian Smith, who was formerly with the Cure Center, is giving a talk to some students, and they're at the Kemeny Recreation Center there in Detroit, a recently redeveloped recreation facility. And you see just over Brian's head, past the grass there, the Marathon oil refinery. And this spot's really an interesting place on our tour because you can hear the steady rumble of traffic from Interstate 75, which is also between Bryan and the refinery. You can also smell some of the odor from the oil refinery itself. And then, of course, you've got the community center right there, which is a really important asset for the neighborhood, juxtaposed with the very heavy industrial use and the tank farms. You can see some of the oil storage and petrochemical storage tanks there in the background of that photo as well. And I'll add, I'm not sure if she's able to join the call, but Teresa Landrum recently gave a presentation to my environmental law clinic class, and she talked about a lot of the impacts to the neighborhood near the Marathon refinery. And this is the zip code some of you may have heard about, 48217, which is one of the more polluted zip codes in the state and also in the country. And one of the main reasons for that is the pollution that comes from the Marathon oil refinery. And the picture on the left there, these are from courtesy of Teresa again. And on the left, you have the picture of the refinery when it was undergoing a major expansion. And Teresa would tell us that, and it's absolutely true, that over time, over many years, as that oil refinery would expand, as they would add new processes, or most recently, they added the ability to refine heavy tar sands oil, which created this petcoke byproduct that we'll talk about in a minute. As they were expanding and adding these coking facilities there at the refinery, they were infringing more and more on the neighborhood, that had been there, for many, many years. Generations of folks had lived there, and you started to have people that may have lived a few blocks away from the fence line of the refinery were now directly adjacent to it. And this is problematic for many reasons, but one is that the homes that were offered a buyout or the ability to sell your property and move, those were always limited, and they were limited to how close they were, the proximity to the facility. So there are people that were living blocks away from the refinery, but over the years, as it's expanded, continued to encroach upon the neighborhoods. And people that really are, if they want to get out, they're kind of stuck because their property values have been diminished by having the refinery so close to them, and it's really difficult to be able to sell your home. And so, again, driving by there or getting out and being able to just kind of hear the noise, smell the odors from this facility is pretty dramatic. And you understand that for people living there are many people that live in the neighborhood. They experience those impacts every single day, all day. and there are very high instances of asthma, higher instances of other diseases, including cancers, that are present in this area surrounding the Marathon refinery. And I guess the other thing I'll just point out is that you'll often hear people say things like, well, why don't people just move? And I talked a little bit about the property value issue. There's also the history of racism here that we cannot ignore, in that historic redlining, or the practice of restricting where people, primarily African Americans, but other people too, where they could live or couldn't live within the city of Detroit and the surrounding suburbs. Many folks were only able to purchase homes in areas next to major industrial facilities. And those facilities, as I said, their footprint, the area where they were operating was smaller back 50, 60, 70 years ago. And over time, they've continued to expand and encroach further into neighborhoods. The other thing is that we know a lot more now about impacts to our health from the emissions or the pollution from practices like refining oil into gasoline. We now know that it is harmful to our health, and we know that people that live on the fence line, that live close to these facilities, that they experience higher amounts of pollution than people in other areas. So that's an important part for us to talk about on the tour. We also discuss a couple major incidents they've had there. The picture on the right is from an explosion and a fire at the refinery. And this is a key environmental justice issue as well, because the communities surrounding the refinery responded in different ways to these major incidents like explosions. The city of Melvindale actually warned residents and told people that they should evacuate, whereas the city of Detroit did not at the time. And so there's a question of, why did that occur? Why was that the practice? There's been, now a series of events, including a malfunction at one of their gas flares back in February of 2019 that caused a major odor to occur in neighborhoods around the facility, and people were getting sick, people were getting nauseous from that odor. There's been a series of these events, and there's also been a push to try and change the emergency response from the city and from the other local units of government to make sure that people are adequately warned and are able to protect themselves and their families if you have this type of an event happen, which, as I mentioned, sadly, it has occurred multiple times in the past. Okay, so then we would kind of continue along our tour. And, it isn't all industrial sites and talking about pollution from major industrial sites. We also like to highlight some of the more sort of like neighborhood involved activities like community gardens or urban agriculture, and talking about the really powerful, interesting, important work that's going on at the neighborhood level to take areas of land that are maybe vacant or properties that were perhaps abandoned and that people maybe had been doing some illegal dumping or something like that, and people really taking ownership and coming together to put that property to really productive use for the community and for the neighborhood. And so we'll typically stop at a couple different community gardens. We'll also go to Eastern Market, and we'll talk about some of the work that groups like the Detroit Food Policy Council and Keep Growing Detroit and others are doing to really help ensure that Detroiters have access to good, affordable fruits and vegetables. And that one way to do that is by growing it right here in the community. And so we always want to highlight those types of things on our tour as well, and to just really lift up the fact that while Detroit has changed from its industrial past and industrial present, and while it's continuing to change, that there's a lot of really good, exciting work going on at the neighborhood and community level to kind of reimagine and rethink like what our neighborhoods will look like and how we can make sure that we're providing the healthiest and safest environment to our neighbors here in the communities. Okay, so that's again a much abridged version. I did want to mention just one other stop that we typically make on our windshield tour, and that's the Detroit Renewable Power Facility, which often is just called the Detroit Incinerator. That's a facility that for many years we at Cures and a lot of our partner organizations have been working to kind of analyze and try and look at what the actual health and environmental impacts were from that facility. And then over time, speaking for myself and not for Cures, my environmental clinic and groups like the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center and the Ecology Center, many organizations, Zero Waste Detroit, over the years, worked at advocacy trying to shut that facility down. And so what we would do is we'll drive around and we would look at this, and this is a facility that receives municipal solid waste, trash, and then it would take that trash and then burn it in a series of boilers. Those boilers would then generate steam, and the facility would generate electricity, but it would also generate a lot of pollution. And Nick Leonard, my colleague at Great Lakes Environmental Law Center, did some amazing work looking at where the trash was coming from. The majority of it was coming in from suburban communities. Suburban communities were actually paying less to have their waste disposed of at the incinerator than Detroiters were paying. Meanwhile, Detroiters are dealing with the burden of that pollution from the burning of the waste there at the incinerator. Well, the good news there is that eventually the incinerator announced its plans to shut down, again, through a lot of advocacy. An organization called Breathe Free Detroit, which we'll have some slides of later, was really key in putting a lot of pressure on the city, advocating at the mayor's office and city council level, as well as at the state, and even in federal offices to try and get that incinerator shut down. So that was a real key advocacy success that we actually talked about in this program last year. And I just wanted to mention it because it's an issue that we continue to have in Detroit, and that is that we have these major industrial facilities that are heavily polluting, that are smack dab in the middle of neighborhoods. So whether we're talking about 48217 and Marathon, or we're talking about Delray, or we're talking about Midtown next to the incinerator, we've got these facilities that where people live, right there, right next to them, in close proximity, and that means you're going to have conflicts. You're going to have issues, whether it's odor. The incinerator often was cited for odor violations from the smell. I didn't live near there, but I worked near there for many years, and I have a lot of memories of walking down the street and smelling the odor coming from the incinerator. Not pleasant, very offensive, and so that was a key advocacy success. And so it's just important to realize that we have a lot of these heavily polluting sites in the city that are next to schools, that are next to homes, that are next to businesses, and that's part of it is just a historical issue that we've had. Part of it is, again, dealing with some of these historic racist practices like redlining, and then some of it is just zoning that hasn't worked appropriately. And so I'll talk a little bit more about zoning and what I mean by that, and some ways for us to be involved to hopefully rectify some of these problems going forward. Carrie, I see you there. Do we have some questions?
We do. Can I interrupt you, Nick?
Please.
Thanks. So one question in our chat box. It's great to know about community gardens. Are these affected by nearby polluters?
Great question. So one of the things that groups like Keep Growing Detroit and the cures we've actually supported over the years through some little mini grants. Occasionally we'll have some resources that we can invest in the community, is looking at what's in the soil. So one thing we would recommend before, whether it's a community garden or even having your own backyard garden, having your soil tested. And that's something that, again, you could reach out to us at Cures and we can connect with these organizations, but there's many groups here in Detroit that can link you up with people that can help with getting your soil tested. Michigan State University, they're a land grant university, meaning that part of their mission is to focus on agriculture, and they can also help with soil analysis and telling you, whether your soil has high amounts of lead or other pollutants present in it because of air pollution. So just think about this, like anything that we put up in the air that goes up in a smokestack eventually comes down, right? It'll either land on the ground or it'll land in the water. And just if you think about something like, you may know that we have fish advisories in the Great Lakes where we're only supposed to eat so much fish that comes out of the Detroit River or out of Lake Erie because of mercury pollution. Well, that mercury actually comes from burning coal in coal-fired power plants. That's how the mercury gets into the water and then gets into the fish. What goes up must come down. And the same thing is true for land. So definitely we want to be concerned about that. It's a good idea to have your soil tested. I think the best practice that at least that I've been made aware of by experts in the area is by having raised beds where you can actually, you either make your own compost or you bring in clean soil compost and then grow your plants in raised beds so you're not putting them directly in the ground. That's a good way to ensure that you wouldn't have any contamination from the soil. And the other thing is that if you are in an area where you're downwind from major industrial sites, a good practice would be to wash off those beautiful tomatoes in August before you eat them, just in case any dust particulates have fallen on there that could potentially be harmful.
And one more question, Nick, before we transition into how advocacy works. Anthony mentioned that it's great that the incinerator will be shut down. No doubt, we all agree with that. And there should be accountability from those that allowed that to happen. And I just wonder if you could talk about a transition plan, or about how that waste will be dealt with in the future.
Yeah, and currently, so this is a really tough problem to get at. So we knew that the incinerator was impacting, the neighborhoods around it. We knew that it was a major source of air pollution from the burning of that waste, that trash. But the question is, what do you do with that trash if you're not incinerating it? And the owners of the facility, which, interesting historical footnote, I know many people on the call know this, but the facility was originally built with public money. There was an authority called GIDRA, the Greater Detroit Resource Recovery Association or something, that GIDRA, that was actually used public money to build this facility. And it was, intended to be a job creator and an asset for the city of Detroit. And in some ways it was. However, it was eventually sold. It was privatized, sold off to private industry. And a lot of that public money, that investment was basically lost, right? And meanwhile, you had the pollution that was visited upon people in the neighborhoods at a much higher rate than other parts of the city and other parts of the state. Okay, so what do we do with that waste? Well, most of it now is being landfilled. That's the truth. It's being trucked to landfills and being put at the dump. And so what I think we need to think about, and maybe this is something we can talk a little bit more about in the advocacy part, is how do we change that? How do we reduce the amount of waste that is being landfilled? Groups like Zero Waste Detroit, now working at Michigan Environmental Council, they have been pushing for years and years and years to try and get not just curbside recycling in the city, but really robust recycling programs where we're diverting waste from going then to the incinerator or now to the landfill. So recycling, composting, food scraps, those are things. Food waste is a huge percentage of the amount of waste that goes to the landfill. So trying to reduce food waste and to do things like composting, it's a great strategy. And then of course, reusing things rather than throwing them away, trying to get secondhand stuff. I've really turned into a person who focuses on this, and if I had hair, I'd pull it out when I walk around my neighborhood and I see the number of bins people have out on trash day. It really gets me. I'm almost to the point of like leaving little notes on people's garbage piles, but I haven't got there yet. But that's the truth, is that it's being landfilled, and so the way that we can stop that from happening is by reducing our amounts of waste, recycling when we can, and all of that. And many of these things, of course, are now exacerbated by the pandemic because some of the recycling centers have been closed. Using more like takeout food and things have created more containers. So, these are things, coming out of the pandemic, we really need to redouble our efforts on reducing waste. So, okay, thanks for those questions. We good to move on, Carrie?
I did post the link to Keep Growing Detroit, which is a local organization that does soil testing, as Nick mentioned. And we are ready.
Okay, so what we'll do now is we'll talk a little bit about how advocacy works and what we mean by advocacy. And that word can mean different things in different contexts. So I'm a lawyer, I represent clients, and I would advocate before a judge. I would sometimes advocate before a jury. I've actually never done that. Most of our environmental cases are in front of a single judge or in front of an administrative panel, that kind of thing. So I've never actually, been able to work at trying to charm a jury or something like that. But that's a type of advocacy. Advocacy also is pushing elected officials to, well, take a step back, pushing candidates for office to get on the record as to what they will do in a certain scenario. Will they support if we're talking about members of Congress, would they support legislation aimed at battling climate change, aimed at reducing our greenhouse gas emissions? Working to get them on the record, that's a form of advocacy, because then we can try and hold them accountable once they're in elected office. As elected officials, contacting them, pushing them either for a specific piece of legislation or telling them that you're concerned about a particular series of events. I've got a long list of concerns today. I've been regularly emailing representatives and senators for a variety of reasons, but that's a type of advocacy, certainly. Public comments, and we'll talk about all of these more now as we get into this presentation, but public comments going to a hearing where there's a discussion over a ordinance at city council or a school board meeting where there's discussion about particular educational policies, going to a committee hearing in Lansing at our state legislature, letting your voice be heard in those ways, that's a form of advocacy. Certainly writing letters to elected officials, also to agencies, and I'll talk more about what I mean by agencies, but the executive branches of our state and federal governments, those folks, we can often advocate there too, trying to push for environmental and public health positive change. And so depending on the forum or the venue where the advocacy is taking place, it can mean different things. Today, we're going to talk about advocacy, more at a local level, but I will highlight some of the kind of key intersections between federal government, state government, and then local units of government, and the importance that our advocacy as individuals, as heads of organizations, as whether if we're teachers or doctors or nurses, whatever we are, how we can be effective advocates at the local level. And again, I'll talk about some of those intersections with state and federal governments as well. So the pictures here, you've got the US Capitol on the left and then our Capitol in Lansing on the right. Very similar setup in terms of who is in our legislatures at the federal level as well as at the state level. We have a state house and a state senate, just like we have a federal house and federal senate. And they have committees that are assigned. So here in Michigan, we have environment committees. We have a committee that deals with the Great Lakes. So there are different points of access for us as the public to try and advocate for positions that we believe in or for legislation rules and things that we believe make sense. And then of course at the federal level, you have a very similar situation, just noting that as you go up a step, so as you go up from the state to the federal, of course, a member of Congress is representing more people than a Michigan House representative, just based on population. They have many more constituents. A lot more money is involved as you get up at the federal level. So there's more levers of influence at the federal level than there may be at the state level. And so we as the public might have a better chance at having our voice heard and being very effective at the state level. And even more so when we talk about local units of government, the communities that we live, the places where we work, recreate, pray, all of that, we can often be even more effective because there's fewer people in line advocating at the local level than there is at the state or federal levels. And so I'm sure you might remember this from high school or maybe college. The three branches of U.S. government, of course, you've got legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislature, which I've just been talking about, at the federal level, we have our Congress, which is our House of Representatives. And then, of course, we have the Senate. Each state has two senators. And then they together form the Congress. And they're the ones that introduce, debate, pass legislation, pass laws, make laws that then we all must follow. Federal laws have supremacy over state laws. So there's a conflict between a state law or a local law. The federal law is supreme, and it would, in most instances, would be the controlling law. If there's something that's passed by Congress and it's specific to an issue like the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, in general, those laws have supremacy over state or local laws that would conflict with that federal law. Also at the federal level, the executive. So of course, we think of the president, the vice president, but agencies are very, very important, especially for advocacy opportunities. Agencies that are run by members of the cabinet or that are run by other political appointees. So at the federal level for environmental stuff, you might be thinking Environmental Protection Agency, and that's absolutely correct. That's an agency that has broad oversight and broad activities within federal government and many federal agencies. They're responsible for making sure that environmental reviews before major infrastructure projects are developed, anything involving federal money or federal land, like a national park, a national forest, a military base, any of that kind of activity, EPA has oversight to make sure that they're assessing environmental impacts and trying to limit environmental harm. And the executive branch is also responsible, pursuant to an executive order that was signed by President Bill Clinton, to consider environmental justice impacts from federal activities. And so that would again be major infrastructure projects with federal money, activity on federal properties, also where the federal government is a key component of permitting processes. In many instances, they would also be subject to the executive order on environmental justice. So I'll talk a little bit later more about environmental justice, but just note that at the federal level, the protection we have for environmental justice is by executive order. An executive order is something that can be changed by a subsequent administration. When President Trump took office, there was a lot of concern that he would rescind or write a new executive order overturning President Clinton's executive order. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but he did some other things like significantly cutting the budget of the Office of Environmental Justice at EPA that were certainly harmful. So my point is that at the federal level, we also have the executive branch, which runs the federal agencies, things like EPA, where they have a very, very important role to play in environmental policies development, as well as enforcement of people that violate permits and that kind of thing. And there's other federal agencies that have very, very significant environmental impacts, like the Federal Highway Administration, funding for roads and highways and bridges and all of that. The Department of the Interior, which has oversight over our national parks and our Fish and Wildlife Service. The Bureau of Reclamation, which is a bigger deal out west, but they would approve things like dams or major water irrigation projects and things like that. Massive, massive environmental impacts from federal government activity. Okay, so important to always remember those agencies and our ability to influence them and advocate to those agencies, which we'll talk more about in a second. Okay, judicial, I mentioned this at the outset about how an advocate, often an attorney can be considered to be an advocate. For our discussion today, we won't talk very much about the courts, but I will just say right now that often when there are opportunities for litigation to hold a polluter accountable by filing a citizen suit under one of our environmental laws, like the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, often we will need people. We will need individuals who are willing to be what's called a standing witness, someone who will say, I am impacted by the activity of this facility, or I'm worried, I'm concerned that if it's built that my health will be impacted, or my property might be harmed, or my kids might be harmed, or whatever. We often need people to be willing to step up and say, I will be part of this litigation. I will be a standing witness. So you may sometimes hear from attorneys working for environmental organizations or for public health organizations that will need people to help with litigation. So I just wanted to mention that, not the focus of our discussion today, but it is a key part that the public can play in making sure that we have standing, which is the ability to get into court and litigate these very, very complicated issues sometimes that impact our lives and our homes and families and all of that. Carrie, I see you back.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Sorry to interrupt.
No.
Relevantly, while you're on, participation, we have a question from Julius, who's saying there is a huge problem in Detroit with residents being engaged. How do we increase Detroit residents' engagement? Awesome
question, Julius, and I will answer that throughout the next few minutes. Really, really good question. And so, just quickly, the other thing I wanted to mention, if we shift our thinking about state government, there's also agencies at the state level. So you may have heard of EGLE, our Environment, Great Lakes and Energy Department. They were formerly called the Department of Environmental Quality. They handle environmental permitting. They also do things called rulemaking, which I'll talk about in just a second, but making the rules and regulations that polluting industries must follow and that we as citizens must follow as well. And so we have agencies at the state level. And then of course, we have these committees, whether they're committees at the legislative level, our state house and our Senate in Lansing, or in our local communities. We have city council committees within the city of Detroit. We have agencies, if you want to think of them as that way, but like BC, the Building Safety and Engineering Department within the city of Detroit. They function very similarly to agencies at the state or federal level, but they're local here in Detroit, working on, whether it's local permitting for city of Detroit permits or enforcement of code violations, that kind of thing. And then boards, I mentioned school boards, but there's all sorts of different boards. Zoning boards, very, very important, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But that's opportunities for us to get engaged at the local level, where our power is less diluted at the local level. And what I mean by that is people at the city level, whether they're civil servants, working in government, or if they're elected officials, they hear from fewer people at the local level than you would if you're a representative in Congress, just because of the amount of population that they serve. And so often our voices can be much more powerful, especially when you get to even local subsets of government, like a zoning board in the city of Detroit, or a zoning board in Bloomfield Township or wherever. Going there and advocating in front of those boards, you often have an outsized influence because they just hear from fewer people, and also they're more responsive to their people that live within their jurisdiction, their territory. Okay. All right, public engagement, and this will get a little bit, we'll start talking a little bit about your questions, Julius. Normally when we do these events, we have people from different organizations that are joining us. And so we'll hear from their experiences advocating at different venues and events and that kind of thing. So today I picked a few pictures of myself because I didn't want to put pictures up of other people, but I feel a little bit silly having pictures of myself doing these different things. Sort of like a where's Waldo of public engagement. Where's Nick? What's he doing now? And so I'll talk a little bit about opportunities to be involved and how we can try and increase public engagement in these really important issues. Okay, so legislation. I think we oftentimes think like we vote for a state representative, we vote for a member of Congress, and that's it. Where civic duty, job done, we can go away and everything will be fine. Well, that's not true. We need to hold them accountable. We need to pay attention to how people are voting, how our representatives are voting. And we also have the opportunity to try and influence legislation. So every bill that's introduced at the state house, before it ultimately becomes a law, before it's passed and signed by the governor, there are opportunities for the public to weigh in. And those opportunities are typically through contacting our elected officials, sending them an email. This is how this gets done, oftentimes in this day and age. And I'll talk more about how to actually email and reach out to our representatives in a minute. But phone calls are also very important. In fact, if you have the time, making a phone call to your state rep while they're considering legislation, or your state senator, letting them know your opinions, leaving a message with their staff, that often carries more weight than sending an email. And I don't exactly know why, but when you hear about really tough votes or really contentious votes, often the callers that are weighing in from their district, that is more dispositive, or that's what they look to for what the public wants them to do or is pushing them to do. That's not to say they're always going to vote the way that we want them to, but that's a really key way for us to be involved. There's the state of Michigan has a website that actually we can all go to, and it's a legislative tracker where you can look at bills that have been introduced, at what phase they're at, whether they're in a committee or whether they're up for a vote on the House or Senate floor. And that's an opportunity for us to reach out to our elected officials. You can always call or email a representative or a senator that's not your individual representative, but just note that they don't pay as close attention to people. If I'm emailing a state rep up in the Upper Peninsula because I want her to vote a certain way, she's probably not going to give that nearly as much weight as if it's someone from her district, because I'm not a voter. I'm not a person that can actually get her reelected. Remember, the number one job of politicians is, people often joke it's to raise money, but the number one job is to get reelected, right? And if they tell you it's anything different, they're lying to you. So that's always what they're thinking about, is how are my constituents engaging with me? How am I tracking for reelection, assuming they're not term limited out? And that's an important point. Before I move on, term limits. We have term limits in the Michigan House and Senate. And from my perspective, term limits are very problematic. I know some people think term limits are great because that means we're always having new people, new ideas, new blood coming in to our legislature. I think that is all, I just think that's not true. In fact, what we have is we have lobbyists. We have these interest organizations that are often heavily funded by big business or by industrial associations, and they will oftentimes tell legislators like, hey, pass this bill, or here's legislation that we're interested in you passing. And they become, in fact, a part of government because there's so much turnover at our state house or at our state senate that you don't have the long-term expertise and knowledge that legislators would accrue over time. And what I mean by that is that, if I'm elected to the legislature, it's going to take me, if I'm assigned to a committee dealing with, the Great Lakes or something, I know a little bit about that through my work. But if I was assigned a committee, dealing with hospitals or something, that's not an area that I know very much about. It would take me a long time to get up to speed and to know what exactly our medical providers would need from government. So anyway, I just want to put that out there that I think term limits have been a real problem here in Michigan. That's my opinion, of course, not the opinion of Cures, but I think it's been a real problem because you have this constant turnover of elected officials, and just about the time that they learn what they're doing, they can't run again because of term limits. Okay, rulemaking. I mentioned this before. Rulemaking is where, under something called the Administrative Procedures Act, this is a law that dictates how our agencies make decisions. One important power that they have is rulemaking, meaning that they can take a broad directive from the state government or from the federal government, if we're talking up there, and the agencies then can make a rule. And the way that they make a rule is very, very strictly governed by a process in the Administrative Procedures Act, and that process includes public comment. So when there's a rule that's out there for public comment by EGLE, the Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy Department at the state level, we as the public, again, can send in written comments. We can call up EGLE and leave a phone message, let them know what we think about a particular rule. Very, very important, because these rules are often where the whole game is played. It's the agency's interpretation of laws passed by the legislature. So if you haven't heard of rulemaking, it's something to pay attention to. And a lot of advocacy organizations, they will have people in Lansing that are watching very closely what our agencies are doing and when they have rules that are available for comment. And it's a good way for us to weigh in and to give community voices to these processes, because again, they don't hear from very many people at the rulemaking type of legislating that they do. Okay, executive orders. I mentioned at the federal level, President Clinton's executive order for environmental justice continues to be very important. But note that executive orders, they are just signed by either a governor or the president, and those can be overturned by a subsequent governor or president. The next governor can change executive orders or pass their own. And so, Governor Whitmer's issued executive orders dealing with environmental justice, creating an environmental justice advisory committee, also creating very important watchdog positions within environmental justice, and also water quality within EGLE. And that's all very, very good, but could change depending on who the next governor is. And so one thing that we always want to do is, if we can get legislation, if we can get a law passed by the state house, passed by the state senate, and then signed by the governor, that's the strongest protection we can have. It's harder to undo those than it is an executive order that can be changed by a subsequent governor, the next administration. So they're very important tools, and also a really good point of advocacy. So many folks, and again, some of the people on this call were advocating for years under Governor Granholm, advocating for years under Governor Snyder, pushing for more environmental justice protections at the state level. In response to the Flint water crisis, there was a little bit of movement from Governor Snyder after the whole debacle that was. But we saw then a lot of that advocacy starting to really bear some fruit with the Whitmer administration in some of her executive orders. So it's something where it's an opportunity again for us to engage, to send emails, to give phone calls saying, hey, Governor, you have the power to do this. You should do it. And here's why. Don't forget that. That's an important thing for us to advocate for. Okay, at the local level, other words and types of policies you may have heard before, ordinances. So an ordinance, this is basically a law passed by a city or passed by a township or a village. And ordinances regulate things like how loud a car can be, the noise or the radio, the volume of the radio going down the street. There's ordinances that deal with that kind of stuff. City of Detroit, there's an ordinance that bans the burning of trash. You can't do that in your backyard. Those kinds of things at the local level, we would call ordinances. Permits, these are things that regulate pollution. So one thing that always surprises my students is when I tell them that in the United States, our system of laws, we don't say that you can't pollute and that you have to demonstrate why you should be able to. It's basically you can pollute as long as you have a permit, as long as you have a license to pollute. That's the way that the system has been developed in most cases. Now, there are certain things that are just illegal, like we can't discharge radioactive materials into the river. I can't dump oil into the river. Those are just outlawed, and you're subject to a fine. But for many other regulated pollutants, you just have to get a license, a permit to pollute. And so permitting is also a very important way for us to be engaged as a public. And actually on the picture there, this was actually at River Rouge High School. And actually this was a hearing about the Detroit Edison coal plant there in River Rouge, and about some changes that the public wanted to see about the sulfur dioxide emissions that were coming out of that facility. And so this was a permit hearing, a public hearing where people could come and give public comment. This is obviously pre-COVID. It's a few years ago, so we're not wearing masks. And now all of these things are happening virtually. People are on a call just like this, giving public comment. And so an important way for the public to be involved is to go to these hearings or sign up on Zoom, give your comments, and sometimes they can actually sway the ultimate decision by an agency. The agency is not bound to decide one way or another based on the amount of public comments. A great example of this is Nestle bottled water. They own some wells up in northern Michigan, and a couple years ago they were seeking a permit to increase the amount of water that they were pumping, and Eagle, which at the time was DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality, they received thousands of comments against this permit application from Nestle, and only a handful that were in favor of it. Ultimately, the state said that under the law, they had to grant this permit increase to Nestle, or that they were going to allow it to go forward. So even though you had massive public comments against it, the agency still went forward with granting that permit. So I don't want you to think that just because we go and we have 500 people show up and we all make really good and passionate comments at a permit hearing, that permit will be denied. The agency doesn't have to do that, but they do have to consider our comments. And if they don't consider our comments, and if our comments have good issues that are legal issues or scientific technical issues, then that could be litigated. You could potentially have a lawsuit. So it's important at permit hearings to get those comments on the record, so that then the lawyers can take over and can potentially use those comments in arguments challenging a permit or challenging a denial of a permit if that were to be the case. Okay, zoning. I mentioned this one before too, briefly, but zoning is really important. Zoning decides what types of uses can happen on a particular piece of property. So whether it's zoned industrial or heavy industrial, that could allow something like a steel mill to operate. If it's zoned residential, then you would have homes, and depending on the type of residential, maybe you have multifamily homes, apartments, or maybe you have single family homes. Zoning is really key. And at the local level, it's a way for us to have some outsized influence, as I mentioned, because often these are very low attended public meetings where people are able to give comments on decisions that the zoning board is making. And so it's a great way to try and be active and be involved. So for instance, in the city of Detroit, it might be good to try and push for zoning to allow more setbacks or more space between an industrial facility and an elementary school or a high school. Those kinds of things that we could try and push through the zoning board. Or when there's a contentious issue up like redevelopment of an old industrial site, we want to be there and be active at the zoning board, because that will then determine what type of use can be made of that property in the future, whether it will be a park or residential property or a parking lot, right? So those are, again, very important processes to be a part of.
Hi, Nick. Before you move on, we have a question relevant to that. session. So Katie is asking, Senator Chang mentioned wanting to push in 2020 for fines that go into the general fund to be used in communities affected by the most heavier polluters, including Marathon. She wants to know, what can we do to find out where those funds are going, and how can we help Senator Chang advocate for this, and has she been able to make progress in that?
Great question. And just for a little bit of explanation for everybody on the call, typically that's absolutely right. So if a company violates their permit and they're fined, that money would go to the state of Michigan general fund. And at that point, poof, who knows where it goes, right? Is it filling a pothole? That would be nice. Is it going to, pay a salary of somebody at the lottery commission or something? We just don't know. It's a big, massive state budget, and it's really hard to trace it to see where it goes. So, one thing that Senator Chang has been working on is something called supplemental environmental projects. And that's actually where a portion of a penalty against a polluter that they would have to invest back in the community where the harm took place. So, things like requiring the company to, fix up a community center, or to plant more trees in the neighborhood, or to switch their vehicle fleet to electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles to try and reduce emissions, and making part of their penalty be actually tied to a project that benefits the local community. So there's been some advocacy. We've actually got on our Cures website a link to a report that was done by Great Lakes Environmental Law Center on this very issue, trying to change or allow more things to be eligible for these supplemental environmental projects. So that's one thing. I mean, that's definitely something to continue to advocate for, and I think I would talk to your state reps and state senators and support Senator Chang's legislation. Also, that's another thing to advocate with EGLE, with Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, letting them know that you would like to see fines and penalties invested back in the local community, because that's where the harm takes place, right? We talk about an environmental law, this is kind of a big word, but we talk about externalizing costs. It's an economic idea, but we talk about a lot in environmental law, where polluters, what we want them to do is to pay for their pollution. If they're allowed to just pollute and diffuse and spread their pollution all over the place, the public pays for it through healthcare, going to the hospital for asthma, or having contaminated water or something like that. What we want to do is force companies to internalize those costs. And so, yeah, they can still make a profit, but their profit should be after they're paying for the costs of control technology to limit the amount of air pollution that goes up the smokestack. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do here. And the final thing I'll say about these penalties is that they should be penalties. Often these are slap on the wrist type of stuff, and you'll see the statute, the law might say, $500 per incident or per violation or something like that. But then the company will settle with the state, and they'll say, well, okay, what if we come up with one number which sounds kind of big, like $1 million or something, but maybe they had thousands of violations and they could have been fined $5 million. And I'm just, making these numbers up as an example. But that's the other thing, is we want to hold our state agencies accountable when they settle enforcement lawsuits, enforcement actions for less than the statutory minimum, meaning that the company's basically getting a break, because rather than going through a whole court case, which does save some time and save some resources from attorneys and things, they'll settle for less money. So that's another thing, another point of advocacy. But yeah, really good question.
Thanks, Nick. And we are running about 15 minutes behind. And so
not surprising.
Getting to
sorry, I'm rambling.
No, we're learning a lot, and the questions are great. And I did post a link to that report that you referenced by Nick Leonard out of the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center. And then someone else asked for a link that you referred to on legislation coming from the state. That's also in the chat, that link as well. And so as we move into communicating with different audiences and our burning issue, we'll kind of sandwich those things together and then get into
how I can catch us up here too. This, like a lot of this stuff I've already covered, so I can get through it pretty quick. But thanks for that time check. That's really helpful. Okay, so communicating with different audiences. This is the other thing. I talked about advocacy and what does that mean? Well, communication means different things in different audiences. So, here we've got a couple of pictures. We have Breathe Free Detroit, which again was the organization working to shut down the incinerator. And then we've got a group that's, I'm in that picture too, at the United Sound Systems studio there, which is at risk of being either moved or otherwise sold because of the expansion of Interstate I-94. The Michigan Department of Transportation now owns that building, and it's a historic property, and so there's a lot of concern about what could happen there. A lot of really cool, important artists recorded there, and so this was several years ago, basically trying to get some media attention about the risk that this facility was at, that this recording studio was at, based on a proposed highway expansion. So both of these audiences, I mean, really, you're trying to galvanize public support. You're trying to raise awareness. You're trying to get some media coverage if you can. Get some television news, get some articles written in the paper, because that's a way to increase your reach, to get more people to your side, to hear your message. And so that's the type of audience there where you're broad, right? Where we want attention, we want media to show up, we want stories to be written, we want television cameras, all that kind of stuff. And if we can reach more people by organizing, like signing them up, getting them on our email list and things, that's another good thing. Those public events are a great way to galvanize that kind of support. So I have this picture here. This is Representative Tlaib, Rashida Tlaib, and these are just kind of two different venues. And so this is actually, I think the one on the left, she was a state rep at the time, and on the right, I think she was running for Congress. But one, it's basically a protest. She's at right outside of AK Steel on the Dearborn Detroit border, and really there had been a series of events there, some violations of their permit. They had a release of a lot of pollution, and so she was there, demanding action from the state of Michigan at that time, and really, kind of firing up the crowd, right? And then on the right, this was actually at a law symposium at Wayne State. And that's actually State Senator Stephanie Chang sitting there with Representative Tlaib. And there, they were talking more to lawyers, to government people, to law students, and the approach was, much more kind of like technical and more like, okay, well, here's a couple things that I would like to see happen with this particular law, right? So definitely, depending on the audience, even for our elected officials, you'll often see a different approach, right? Trying to, at some points, you're trying to get the television cameras again. Other times, you're really trying to influence other decision makers. So here, Representative Tlaib was basically trying to push for additional health studies and environmental health studies in Detroit, and advocating for more federal money. So again, depending on the audience, if you're testifying in front of a state house committee, your approach is different than if you're out in the street trying to get people fired up. And this is just another example of that. So on the left, I look a little bit angry there. I don't remember exactly what I was saying. Again, this is in South Dearborn, and when we had a couple major pollution incidents there, demanding some enforcement from our state government. And then on the right, we've got a bunch of our Cures team meeting with Senator Stabenow. And so here, in that meeting, I wasn't, I had a kind of a different look on my face in that meeting there. But the point is that when you have an opportunity, if you're fortunate enough to have a sit down with an elected official, particularly a senator, I mean, there's only 100 of them in the whole country. And so if you have the opportunity to tell them your opinion and what you would like them to do on a particular issue, understanding that audience is different again than when we're out trying to get television cameras to cover a protest. Okay, and now we're going to transition a little bit and talk about what's a main issue that we're focusing on right now with Cures, which is this question of digital literacy and the digital divide. And so I'll kick it over to Carrie and Rochelle now to talk a little bit about this, and then we'll get back in to talk about some kind of tips and tricks that we've learned through different advocacy activities that we've engaged in over the years. I
can see your cat Vanna is trying to make her daily appearance.
Yeah, my co-presenter here is Vanna White. She's 18 and she kind of runs the show around here. So
she's the boss.
If you're allergic, it's okay because it's over Zoom.
I am. And to your last slide, Nick, I just wanted to say there was a question in the comment chat box that asked about the role of scientists. And I just want to say about that picture with Stabenow. We had this CAB meeting and had two scientists present. We had Dr. Tracy Baker talking about water quality issues, and also Dr. Chris Trinacosta, who's one of our leaders here. And someone from Stabenow's office was at that meeting, went back and talked about that meeting, and they called us and said, look, we want to hear those presentations again. We have some questions. This for me was one of the most exciting meetings I had sat in, right? I mean, this is the goal of these community advisory board meetings, is to bridge this information for impact. And when Stabenow came to visit us at Cures and toured our labs and saw these presentations, it was really an incredible experience for her to ask about thresholds and water and existing policy. And the scientists kind of go, I don't know that. And Nick to say, I can answer those questions. And it was an incredible experience to be sitting in that room and watch that take place. So kudos to you, Nick.
Well, and Carrie, if I can just add on top of that. So another thing to think about, if you're a scientist or if you're a researcher, think about what capacity you're doing your advocacy. So Carrie and I have done some research, and we actually have a report on communicating with elected officials if you work for a university or if you work for publicly funded research. There's lobbying rules that come into play in that regard. But for if you're a member of the public, lobbying rules don't apply to you, right? Like you can call, you can advocate, you can do what you want. But like if I'm speaking in my official capacity as a professor at Detroit Mercy, I have to make sure that I'm not in some way jeopardizing the nonprofit status of my employer. Okay, and so that's something to think about too, and what lobbying contacts are. That's a different discussion for a different day. But in regards to that question, even if you are a public employee or a publicly funded researcher, you can still educate. You can tell our elected officials what your research found. You can show them the importance of reducing a particular pollutant because it's going to harm our liver or something, right? Like you can do that. You can always educate. It's just that you can't advocate for a specific piece of legislation. You can't say, Senator Stabenow passed this bill, right? That is lobbying. And even that you can actually do as long as you don't do too much of it. And again, that's another discussion for a different day. But to Carrie's point, you just have to be thinking about your role. What hat are you wearing? Are you a citizen here, or are you speaking on behalf of your employer or your official capacity? Then there might be some lobbying rules that come into play. And with that, should we go to our burning issue?
Thanks, Nick. I'll make this quick. We are running about 15 minutes behind just to keep time. So I'll make this brief. I really just want to talk a little bit about the kind of issues we're facing at our center with connecting with individuals throughout Detroit. Our community engagement core takes an approach intentionally to connect with people and get environmental health information into the hands of people that can make decisions about their health, to promote health and protect their health. And we do that by interfacing with people. So we have scientists, and we put on 2 events a year, and we video record those events. And then we go out throughout the city in a very grassroots networked approach to get that information in the hands of people face to face each year. And typically we interface with about 500 people each year. As Nick mentioned, Rochelle joined our team earlier this year, and we really have had to have a hard pause and think about how we're going to continue to advocate and increase environmental health literacy and get this information into the hands of people that can use it in a new way. And what we found and what we knew or appreciated in the past, that people do have issues accessing environmental health and connecting with us online, and that's for a variety of reasons. And also, we don't take for granted that we hold an event and maybe it doesn't work for people's schedule, conflicts with their jobs, other priorities, and maybe they have transportation issues, right? So we really try to take an approach to communicating environmental health science and information in a way that works for people and meeting them where they're at. Rochelle and I have spent a lot of time about how do we adapt in this environment in 2020 and get information out. And what we've learned and what we knew is about 40% of people, 45% of people that we typically interface with in a year said that they didn't use email or access to a computer. And looking more into that, we really have been thinking a lot about digital justice. And not only have we learned that people, these barriers are kind of layered, right? So first, devices are an issue. Not everybody has devices and the technology to be able to connect with us. Second, we learned that what I suspected, but we actually did learn and get it validated, that Detroit has one of the lowest rates of internet connectivity in the nation. And then on top of that, digital literacy is an issue. So I've talked to people that have said, I don't want to use Zoom, or I don't want to download an app and I don't know what that's going to do. I've talked to another individual that had an iPhone, and their family members had iPhones, older versions, and they didn't know that they could use the FaceTime to be able to connect, and that doesn't require, it's a free between those users. So there's some of these digital literacy issues that people are facing, and they don't have the access, right? And what is the problem with that, especially in a pandemic? We've also heard from people, as Nick mentioned, the people that don't have access to these to connect can't participate in these public comments that Nick talked about, right? So when those used to be open to the public and people could physically join, that's one thing, but the disconnect becomes even broader when people can't plug in and advocate for things that are affecting their communities, their neighborhoods, their children, their families. And then also they can't access health protecting information, where to get tests for COVID, other health information that they might be able to access. And so, and I've also heard one of our community advisory board members say she was going in her community door to door to talk to people about resources and services. Some of these forms that people would be eligible for can only be applied for if you have the technology to apply for those things online. So these digital justice issues are affecting our work, but we're thinking about that more broadly. And I said, pose the question to Nick, how do we advocate for something like this? What does it mean when people don't? What are the barriers in terms of advocacy and policy? And so he's gonna help us think about that and other issues that we face. And there was a particular comment about one specific topic that I'll pose to Nick in a few minutes here too. And so I just wanted to pose the challenge to Nick to help us think about how we can advocate for environmental health, advocacy and literacy, but building the foundation of being able to do that with this huge communication disparity, as I see it, and work towards digital justice. So I'll turn it back over to you, Nick.
Great. Thanks, Carrie. And yeah, and this is it's a complicated issue, right? Because, but I'll say this. I mean, one thing to think about is the providers for internet. So, cable or telecommunications companies, you might not know this, but we, as the public, we own the airwaves. We own the digital spectrum. Our government over time sells it off to private companies. But, first of all, advocating to our senators, so Senator Peters, Senator Stabenow, whoever your member of Congress is, letting them know that, broadband internet or internet connectivity is a huge issue in our community. This is important because the federal government, again, they lease the, whether it's telephone, internet, broadcast rights, they sell those or lease them to private companies. And so they have control over, and we of course have the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, that regulates internet, television, phone, all of that. And so, having a federal response, federal investment here makes a lot of sense. So that's one thing I would say, is advocating at that level. The other is at the local level. Local governments determine who they give licenses to provide cable or internet or that kind of thing. I've run into this previously in my life, where a community I lived in, we only had one provider of internet, right? So I guess I won't name any names because it's being broadcast out there. I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want my internet to cut off in the middle of this. But that's a challenge too. You don't have competition. Like some communities basically they give a monopoly to Comcast or WOW or AT&T or whoever it is. So that's another thing to talk at the local level to, your city council, to your, township board, whatever, and say, hey, how about having a little bit of competition here? How about allowing multiple providers the use of, and this gets to like who can use the telephone poles, who can get access to run the wires, run the fiber optic cables if we had those. So that's another really important place to advocate. The other thing I'd say is, again, this gets to state and federal government. We have programs at the federal level to help with communications access. I've seen this. In normal times I ride the bus. I love riding the bus, and that's one of the things that I do. And I'll often see people set up. There's a government program that will provide cell phones to people. So I don't know if any of you have seen this before, maybe had access to this program, but depending on income level or whether you're a senior, you may be able to get a cell phone provided to you by the federal government. This used to also be a program that would, back in FDR, New Deal, one of the New Deal programs was to connect Appalachia with telephones, right? And so that program is carried over through today with cell phones. And so actually, there's a federal program that helps to provide people access to telecommunications. So I think that's another point of advocacy, is saying like, well, wait a minute, why doesn't that program also cover internet? Why doesn't it cover devices for connectivity? Because as Carrie mentioned, I mean, this is a huge issue during the pandemic. How do you do telemedicine? How do you communicate with your doctor if you don't have a tablet or you don't have a smartphone? That doesn't work, right? If you can't see each other, or they can't, listen for symptoms or whatever, that's a problem. And then of course, if you're trying to do just over, using the G's, 3G or whatever it is to connect with your phone data, I mean, that of course adds up really quickly and can be very expensive for people. So that's not a good solution either. So anyway, I think those are maybe some points of advocacy there, Carrie. I hope that maybe answered the question a little bit. Okay, so now we'll move in. We're doing fine on time. I just wanted to reiterate again, this is all stuff that I've talked about, but how do you contribute? How do you actually engage? Telephone calls, as I mentioned, are very important and very persuasive. Calling your city council member, calling your representatives at the state and federal level. They track those calls. They make a note of what people are saying for and against. One of my favorite calls that I ever made was to L. Brooks Patterson, who is now has passed away. He was the Oakland County executive for many, many years. And I called his office when he was opposing the smoking ban, the indoor smoking ban that had been adopted. And I remember specifically talking to his secretary, and I heard an audible sigh when I told her the reasons why I thought his arguments were BS. And that was my favorite one, because I could tell that she was just so fed up with all the calls into her office, basically calling out the hypocrisy of the position that he took. And I won't get into the reasons why, but that was my favorite ever call to an elected official's office. And again, that's at a local, that's a county executive, but calling state reps, state senators, very, very effective. Emails are great. This is especially now the quickest and easiest way to make sure that they get your contact. Typically for state and federal government, those elected officials will send you a response, and sometimes those responses are thoughtful and they've actually looked at what you've said. Other times they're just kind of a canned auto response that they send. So depending on who your representative is and how hard their staff is working on a particular issue or how busy their staff is, that can dictate the level of response that you get from your email. But it's also important, to let them know, make sure you include your address, because you'll want to show them that you are in fact a constituent. So calling, emails, letters, make sure you identify yourself and identify your address, because that way they'll know that you're a constituent. Otherwise, like if I'm calling and complaining about something in Alaska, that might be somewhat persuasive, but it's not nearly as persuasive as if I live in Fairbanks and I'm calling my elected official there in Alaska. So make sure you let them know who you are, and that way your comment will have more weight. Organizing, I mean, all the time, I talk about this till I'm blue in the face with my students. Lawyers, we can do some things, we can help with laws, we can help with lawsuits, but really where the work gets done is at the community level. Community members are experts. They're much more expert at what's going on in their neighborhood than I ever could be. So, leaning on and doing everything that we can to support and scaffold or lift up our community members who can help us organize, who can, get the word out within their communities. That is just so, so important. Getting multiple people to make phone calls is a lot better than having one person. If I can have 10 people call from my Michigan House district to my member of the House, that will be much more persuasive than just me. So those are, organizing is so key. And again, lifting up the people that are actually impacted by these decisions, making sure that they have a seat at the table, that is very, very important. Okay, so we've talked about most of these as well, the public comments, the importance of that, written comments. When there's a permit that's up for public comment, you can send in an email or you can send in a physical letter, and those will be made part of the record for that permit file. Attending them in person, as we talked about, whether it's digitally or actually at a hearing when we're able to do so again. Protesting is important. We have to think about these things as an inside and an outside game. So the inside game would be more of the policy stuff, the experts, the lawyers, the people with knowledge, very specific knowledge about a particular issue, and then listening to public comment. But then the outside game is we got to get people excited about this, fired up, get some media attention. Often the way that we win in environmental and public health policy is through massive public demand for change. And so getting articles in the paper, op-eds, I didn't put this on the list, but those are really good when the editorial, the opinion that you send into the newspaper and it gets published on their website or gets published in the physical paper, those can be very, very helpful and very persuasive. Those kinds of things are all really important. And yeah, I mean, there are times when just taking to the streets is what we have to do. I know many people on the call know this a lot better than I do, but Earth Day, 1970, the reason we have federal environmental laws is because millions of people got out in the streets, engaged in some civil disobedience, and said, we need change, we need laws, we need to protect our environment, we're literally dying. That's how it happened. And that's the way I think ultimately having an inside game and an outside game is how we'll win on a lot of these environmental issues. Supporting causes you believe in. If you have the resources, kicking some money into the organizers, supporting groups that are active in, Lansing, that are pushing for legislation that you believe in. You better believe that industry and big business, they are spending a lot of money on lobbyists. They're spending a lot of money on campaign contributions. And so we need to engage in that area as well. I wish that we had publicly financed elections and that we had limits on campaign contributions that were meaningful or on political action committees that were meaningful. We really don't. And so that means we have to engage too. And so for those of us that have a little bit of spare change around supporting organizations that we believe in and they're advocating for causes that we believe in, that's really important as well. Organizers need to eat, they need to pay their bills just like everyone else. And so that's a really important thing for us to do too. And then litigation, of course, that's where the public can help in the public comment process, set up issues, preserve issues that we can then litigate on appeal. Okay, I will not get into these in any detail, but just a few laws that you should know about. The Freedom of Information Act, really important law. That's how we as the public get access to records that our government has in their possession. So if I wanted to know who is the broadband internet provider in the city of Detroit and the city I couldn't find out on their website, a quick way would be to send in a FOIA request. And it's outside the scope of today's discussion to get into detail there, but that is how we as the public get records that our government, local, state, federal, there's a federal Freedom of Information Act as well. Very, very important law. Open Meetings Act. When you have a board, a commission, a committee, a council meeting, those have to be open to the public and the public has to have notice. So they need to, if it's a regularly scheduled meeting, they meet every Tuesday of the month, the first Tuesday of the month, they have to let you know that, they have to publish that, they have to provide a meaningful opportunity for public to engage. So in this day and age, a lot of that is virtual, as Carrie was talking about, and there's a challenge there with folks that don't have the ability to connect either by internet or with devices. That's definitely a problem, but courts have said right now, having these types of public meetings is permissible under the Open Meetings Act. So, we need to organize there. If we have people that want to give a public comment, that want to speak, we need to make sure that they can get, borrow someone's phone or perhaps go to the library or something like that, and make sure that they have that access. National Environmental Policy Act, and then the two Michigan laws that I mentioned there. Those are both important because they provide for public comment opportunities for permits that we talked about, permit hearings, but also for things like rulemaking that I also discussed earlier, the ability for the public to comment and engage. Those laws are what provide us that opportunity. And it's important that we do so. Otherwise, we could never litigate any permit challenges or any rules that we don't like if we don't have preserved comments that we can cite in our litigation. Carrie?
Yeah, Nick, can you just talk a little bit about the role of social media in contributing to the advocacy process?
Thank you. Great question. And yeah, hugely important. I mean, you'll now see often companies, especially public companies that are trying to sell us products, trying to make money, they will respond much more quickly to a Facebook post that gets a bunch of interactions, or a tweet where they're added, and you know, where people are made aware of it and they get a lot of negative publicity on social media. You'll often see responses right away from companies now. It's amazing. You know, these are companies that before, you know, you would never hear back from on any issue. They felt sort of insulated, but social media has given us access and that kind of a platform. So that's good. Also a really great organizing tool. So, you know, whether it's a Facebook group or an event, using social media tools to help organize, to get people together, to strategize. Okay, you know, we're going to send, you know, 50 emails today, 50 emails tomorrow, 50 emails on Wednesday. You know, that kind of stuff. Using social media as a way to organize, it's a very powerful tool. And then, of course, many elected officials and I guess decision makers, or maybe thought leaders, if you want to use that term, they are on social media as well. So, you know, I will often send a tweet to, you know, the governor or the lieutenant governor or my state rep or my U.S. representative, letting them know what I think. You know, the one thing I would say about social media is that it's out there. Once you put it out there, it's out there forever. And so, you know, being respectful, making sure that we're making comments that are not threatening, making sure that our comments are responsible. That's a really good practice to keep, because the last thing you would want is to, you know, first of all, break a law, right? If you're threatening or intimidating someone, but that doesn't, you know, lead to a good discourse. Reporting, when you see that behavior, reporting it to the social media company themselves, but also to the authorities if you do think it looks like a threat, or if it's actual threats of violence, making sure that gets reported to law enforcement. That's really important. But one thing I always caution my students, and I'll say here, is that you know, what you put out there on social media is out there for the world to digest. Even often when we think things are maybe private or within a group of friends, stuff gets out there, it gets around. And so, you know, just being responsible about that, and thinking about, you know, is this something that we would want to read on the front page of the Detroit News or the Detroit Free Press? You know, my grandmother used to always tell me, she'd say, "Don't embarrass me, just don't embarrass me." And so I think about that oftentimes when I'm talking to the media, or when I'm, you know, when I'm sending that Facebook post, I want to make sure that it wouldn't embarrass my grandmother. So, but great point, Carrie. And social media has become a very key organizing tool, as well as a way to drive public engagement, to drive public comments, and to get people to show up. You know, I talked about protesting and those kinds of direct action activities. Social media is a really good way to get support, get people together, and to get organized. Okay, I'm going to go through this really quick, but I wanted to give one example of kind of from the beginning of the issue all the way through the end to a good outcome, how advocacy can work at the local level. And again, using all layers of government to try and push for change, push for advocacy. Carrie, do you have a question before I move on?
Yeah, could I just give a little context about this presentation that you're going to give? And it's related to one of the questions in the chat, which is, what is the role of scientific data in advocacy? And I think that this example is going to illustrate how you worked closely with researchers with Cures to collect data on this pet coke. So I think
Thank
this,
you. Yeah, that helps tee it up and kind of frame my thinking. So, okay, so petroleum coke, I mentioned the Marathon refinery expansion, and we had the picture of they're greatly expanding their footprint there. And one of the byproducts of refining tar sand oil is this material called pet coke. And back, boy, I want to think this like 2013. At this point, it's been a while, but these piles were just appeared sort of on the Detroit River, and this was just downriver from, well, you can see Central Depot there, just downriver from the Ambassador Bridge, and you can see that rail car in the picture on the left to give you a scale of how big those piles were. Over 30 feet high, some of them even more than that. And this pet coke, it's very carbon intensive, a lot of high carbon content. There's some other heavy metals there. And to the point about science, one key question we had to answer was, what is this stuff and is it harmful? And so I'll get to that in just a minute. But the picture on the right, that's actually it's a still from a video that was shot by a group called Windsor on Watch. And that was the pet coke dust blowing across the Detroit River into Windsor, Ontario. And that video started circulating around, started getting a lot of attention. And the first question was, what is this stuff? We thought initially, I started getting phone calls, and initially the thinking was that it was coal, actual coal or coal dust. And then after a lot of digging around, we actually found out that it was this petroleum coke. And I'll talk about, it was created by Marathon, but how did it actually get there? And then who was in control of it at that site? Who was responsible? That became a very tricky question for us to answer. So kind of right away, we started having some events, some public events to try and get the word out and try and, figure out what exactly was going on. And so, one of these here, and these I think were actually a year apart. You can tell one I have a beard, one I don't. Meeting the gentleman on the far left, that's Dr. Joe Caruso. He was a researcher at Wayne State at the time, and we were actually analyzing samples, looking at this pet coke and trying to figure out, what exactly was in it. Dr. Caruso and others at the Cures team helped us look into the literature, the scientific literature at the time, to see, whether this petroleum coke was something that was, A, harmful if you breathe it in or if you swallow it, or B, harmful if it gets in the water and over time, if it, degrades and then is absorbed in the water itself, what are the potential risks there? And so this was a meeting, and you can't see her face, but with the woman in the hat, that's Rhonda Anderson. Rhonda from the Sierra Club, who's, just been a wonderful mentor to me and just an incredible leader in Detroit in the environmental justice world. And, Rhonda and I and Joe were talking to Gary Peters and Debbie Stabenow. And this was actually, Gary Peters was in the U.S. House at this time. And so that was part of his district where that pet coke was. And so, we were trying to get some answers. We were asking for federal money. We wanted research. We wanted to know what this stuff was it harmful? All of the studies up to that point had been funded by the petrochemical companies. There wasn't a lot of good independent research that had been conducted. So, that was part of the advocacy. On the right there, that's actually a press conference we did right near the pet coke piles when they were first there, appearing there on the river. And part of what we were trying to do was to work for accountability. I mentioned the difficulty of figuring out who was in control of that pet coke. So it was produced at Marathon. Then Marathon contracted with a trucking company to haul it from the refinery to the riverfront there. And then at the riverfront, it was stored by this company called Detroit Bulk Storage. And then they would sell it to other companies that would load it onto ships and take it all over the world. Pet coke, I mentioned it's very carbon intensive. You cannot burn it in the United States. It's often mixed with coal at electric power generating facilities or in other industrial processes, like perhaps making low-grade steel and other things like that. Can't do it in the United States or Canada. So this stuff was being shipped to other parts of the world, India. And so other companies would buy it. In fact, the Koch brothers, KOCH, the Koch brothers, they had one of their other brothers, not Charles or David, another one, had a company that was actually buying that material, putting it on ships and sending it to other parts of the world. And so, when we started asking for accountability and trying to get those questions answered, there was a lot of, finger pointing. It's not you, it's not me, it's the guy behind the tree. I'm not responsible, they're not responsible. The property ownership was very difficult to figure out because Detroit Bulk Storage leased the property. And one of the owners of the property, or at least part of the property, was Crown Enterprises, which is the company, one of the companies that was founded by Maddie Maroon, who owns the Ambassador Bridge. And so, you start kind of trying to unwind this confusing cast of characters to figure out who's accountable. Well, anyway, long story short, the pet coke was stored there on the riverfront without a permit. Now Senator Peters, but at the time Congressman Peters, was instrumental in pushing for some studies to be done at the federal level. Rashida Tlaib, who at the time was a state representative, Rashida was awesome. I mean, she was really getting attention on this issue and helped determine that there were open stormwater drains, open basically like sewer grates, where the pet coke, when it rained, would just wash directly into the Detroit River. So, wasn't treated or anything like that. So, Gary Peters was able to work with the state and others to get those storm drains covered. So at least the pet coke wasn't washing directly into the river. The dust blowing off these piles, that's something that we call fugitive dust leaving the site of the property there. And that led to a question of, well, why isn't Detroit requiring these piles to be covered? Or why isn't the state of Michigan requiring these piles to be covered? Well, after doing some digging, and this is where I got involved with my law clinic and with Great Lakes Environmental Law Center, we looked around and found that, well, gosh, there really isn't any regulation that deals with this type of material. And also in Detroit, we didn't have an ordinance that dealt with the bulk storage of materials. And so that started the process moving of working on legislation, both at the federal level, the state level, and locally in the city of Detroit. And scientists were very important because, the Cure Center and other, Sean McElmurray and other scientists at Wayne State, they were using their equipment, analyzing. We collect pet coke from the street where the trucks would drag it in and out on their tires. The dust was landing on people's homes, landing on businesses. What's the restaurant right there? I'm drawing a blank. It'll come to me in a second. Green Dot Stables. They were upset because they're getting the dust on their outdoor dining tables and things. And so, it was a real problem. We were taking that dust and analyzing it. The scientists were really important to help us know what was in this stuff, whether or not it was harmful. And so, very, very important working with researchers, working with community members, and then getting our elected officials on board with trying to push for some change here. Okay, so after all of that, fast forward a few years of very, very intensive work done by many members of the community within Detroit, pushing for an ordinance that would deal with pet coke dust, but also deal with the bulk storage of all materials within the city of Detroit. Requiring fencing, requiring materials to be covered, making sure that dust doesn't blow off of sites. And I should say, on the pet coke side of things, the city came around and started ticketing Detroit bulk storage every day for having those piles there stored illegally. Ultimately, that stuff was moved to Toledo, Ohio, and their port facility is not nearly. There aren't as many residential areas or businesses next to their port. So, and I'm not exactly sure where all the pet coke is going today. My understanding is still a lot of it still goes to Toledo before it's shipped off elsewhere. A lot of it's moved by rail car and by truck. But anyway, it was moved off the river after there was some ticketing. There had been a proposal to then store it further down the river. And that was actually one permit that was denied because of massive public engagement and outcry against the open storage. Somebody I'm sure on the call will remember, I think that was also in River Rouge, where there was a proposal to store this stuff at a kind of a dock facility right along the Detroit River. And that permit request was actually denied. Okay, so after all that, fast forward a few years, and you had a lot of really good organizing done by residents, by environmental organizations, pushing the city of Detroit to pass an ordinance that would cover bulk storage of materials and that would prohibit that dust from leaving the piles and getting into homes and businesses and harming the environment. So that's Council Member Raquel Castaneda Lopez. She was the key driver within Detroit City Council on pushing for this ordinance, working with a lot of different organizations, and a lot of organizing had to take place to put pressure because we knew that we had a couple council members that were supportive, but you needed a majority. And so eventually there were all sorts of misinformation efforts by industries in Detroit, arguing that this ordinance would put them out of business or would be way too difficult for them to comply with. So there had to be a lot of pushback too from that type of misinformation, and to try and build political support. So calls, emails, letters going into members of city council to get them on board. And ultimately, I think it passed 7-2 when the vote finally went through to get this ordinance put in place. So that was huge, and it was again informed by science. We had letters of support from different researchers, scientists that were concerned about dust, fugitive dust coming off of piles, whether it's pet coke or other materials. So that was a huge win, and very, very good work by Councilmember Castaneda Lopez. Also, many other members of the community. Hats off to all of them. And then now the question is accountability. We've had Marathon has sought a variance now multiple times for this ordinance for actually the storage of the pet coke at the refinery before it gets moved away. And so we have to keep showing up, and when they're up for a variance, we need to submit comments and say no, they should have to comply with the ordinance just like anybody else. And so that accountability continues to be an issue. And we not only have to watch companies and what they're doing, we also have to watch the city of Detroit and make sure that they're following their own ordinance and enforcing it. So that's just, I think, a nice example that shows, how all these different constituencies work together. How, when we win, the way that we do it is by starting with the community, getting community involved, listening to what their expertise and then trying to then connect with scientists, with lawyers, with advocates to build a coalition to push for something. And then ultimately, if you can find an elected official to champion your cause, that's great. And then you work with them, help them answer questions, refute misinformation, and then build political support within city council or within state government, whatever the case may be.